Welcome everyone, it's been a while since we last saw one another. If you watched my previous Blue Archive video, you will already know this one may follow a similar vein. In today's video, we will discuss and answer one question: is Genshin Impact's story good? Now, I will make a more in-depth video discussing characterization in Genshin, whether it's handled correctly or mishandled and in what ways, but this one's going to go over the entire storyline of Genshin and not necessarily just from a pure lore perspective. I don't want to primarily just focus on the books and tidbits of information you can find in weapons. I also want to focus on the gameplay itself. How is it told to you as a player, especially if you're a new individual who maybe doesn't want to watch lore channels. And I think because of that, it makes this slightly more difficult to talk to and talk about. Because depending on who you are, if you're a whale, and let's say you have something like Primordial Jadewing Spear and the Unforged, you have a bit more lore access than other individuals. So I'm talking about this just from a pure player perspective, as in you're not hunting for artifact sets or you're not hunting for a specific weapon just for the lore reasons. So, is Genshin story good? There are 3 separate acts, and each of those have interludes. You have Act 1 is in Mondstadt, Act 2 is in Liyue, and Act 3 is in Inazuma. Now, right off the rip, Genshin gets a bad point, or a point taken off, essentially because a great or extremely important plot points are hidden away in events that don't come back, meaning that if you're a newer player, or if you're an older player, you have entirely different interpretations on the lore and entirely different experiences. In turn, this essentially means that your progress and your understanding of the game itself is very different. With all of this being said, I think it's very important to discuss how Genshin's story has changed over time and how the Traveler, who originally was the character you play as and you're supposed to learn about the world with, distanced himself from you. Primarily, the Traveler was seen and was regarded as a self-insert protagonist. He didn't speak because Paimon did all the talking, and as a result of that, you were supposed to insert yourself in the Traveler's shoes. And this worked, in my opinion. Early on, it was a good idea because the Traveler didn't know much about the world, you didn't know much about the world. The Traveler's goal was to search for a sibling, you probably didn't care, and ultimately, it did at least give the game some ground to stand on, a foundation. Over time, though, the game has really exemplified certain issues that are, in my opinion, a bit more egregious than others. Genshin has a good story, Genshin has a good opening, it has a strong opening with this strong cutscene, but it doesn't really do much after that. The Archon quests themselves differ greatly in length, quality, and interaction. An important thing to discuss here, in my opinion, is player agency. It is, in my opinion, one of the most important aspects of storytelling, especially if you are going to present the player with a dialogue option. A prime example of player agency is either going to be the Mass Effect series or the Walking Dead series, even Life is Strange, and certain games that really allow your choices to affect the game itself and the characters exemplify this point extremely well. When you, as a player, feel you play an important role, you are much more inclined to learn about the characters, to learn and explore the backstory of them, and ultimately, this lends itself really well to understanding the world, but also great storytelling. However, Genshin itself follows what I like to call a false player agency, or the falsification of choice. You are presented with dialogue options that say the exact same thing and do not change the outcome. You as an entity do not have a choice. You as an entity do not affect the game. You don't affect the characters. And I'm not saying we should. But what I am saying is that without that access, without us having to choose, without us really having a character to play, instead we are watching for most instances, there is little to no reason for the average player to run around and learn about the lore, to read artifact sets or books or the weapon descriptions. Because for what good does it do you? You don't read a weapon description or the lore that you find in a book and then get to find something unique in that location in the game itself. There is no benefit to exploration. An example of a game that really rewards you for exploration is the Fallout series and the Elder Scrolls series, specifically Skyrim. Both of these, you will read a book, you can get a quest from said book, and subsequently after that, it will notify you and allow you to explore a new domain, a new area. Genshin doesn't reward you for exploration in the same way because it does not reward you for choosing to look behind that waterfall. It does not reward you for choosing to read that book about Rex Lapis. Instead, it tells you and you do it or you don't. So player agency isn't necessarily a thing to consider in this, which doesn't help the story in the slightest, especially when, for certain Archon quests, specifically the Liyue variant, you are doing what amounts to a giant fetch quest. Once again, you as a player don't matter, and you're basically following Aether and Paimon, or Lumine and Paimon depending on which protagonist you chose. The benefit of this is that Paimon is supposed to serve as your guide, as she herself mentions. But the downside of this is that it only works for the first act because a lot of the information that the game hinges on, such as Khaenri'ah, is known to the protagonist. They state witnessing it, they state being there, but it is not known to you, as you yourself have not experienced this nor seen it. So it creates this discrepancy in which you are now disconnected from the world entirely. And because of that, you're now in this instance where you're supposed to connect with a protagonist you don't understand or know the history of, with a guide who you don't understand or know the history of, and characters who you don't understand and know the history of. And plenty of games do have characters that you learn about over time, but you oftentimes learn about those characters with the character you play as. Another individual instance of this and how badly something can be affected by a simple word or simple questline is the concept of time in Genshin. Now, I'm not going to say and claim to be an expert on everything correlated to Genshin Impact, but here's what I will state. If you're going to create a story that hinges on you being fast, you need to give the player some indication that it matters. Games such as Deus Ex will give you a certain time frame. They'll say you need to do something quickly, and if you don't do that thing quickly, you will fail. But it won't be a simple game end. It won't be a simple reset. No, you have merely failed the quest, and that's it. No going back. This means that your actions have consequences. You choosing to explore and goof around does affect the world itself. Genshin seems to want to have its cake and eat it too. It wants to tell you that you are on a quest to find the 7 Archons and to find your sibling, and this is important and you should do this fast. But it also seems to want you to make cakes, run around at islands, take a beach vacation, nothing that really assists you in your journey. And as a direct result of this, there's a disconnect between your end goal and what the game is saying it's supposed to be versus what you're actually doing. It raises the question of, does the traveler even want to find their sibling? But that is for another time in regards to the characterization of the traveler, and I will be going through all of Genshin's main or most important characters and discussing their characterization, whether it's a flop or a fail, and what discourages me from talking about or playing certain units. So, to answer the overall question presented here, is Genshin's story good? No, it isn't. Unfortunately, it's not. I can see potential. I can see a lot of potential here, but the game disjoints and disconnects itself, and you don't really have enough time to bond or learn about the characters to really care about them when they're important. I know Xiao got his story quest, and I know people are raving about how great it is, but let's be honest here. If we're talking about storylines, that is something that a lot of players who are new have to grind super fast to get to. And if you're an older player, you've experienced the bad stories, mischaracterization, misused characters, or a lack thereof. One good quest or 2 good quests don't necessarily equal a good story. Raiden is a prime example of a character who has 2 contrasting storylines that don't necessarily flow with one another, including the main Archon quest. Sure, was her second Archon quest or her second story quest good? Yes, it was, but it was also a bit of a mess because it presents and brings in all these new ideas that haven't been explained to the player. But I will talk about that in a separate Raiden video upcoming. Subscribe if you want to see that. Genshin's story has good foundations. If you read the lore and understand it, it can really make a lot of sense to you. But the question that then becomes prevalent is, should it be required or necessary for the player to go out their way to understand what should be explained to them in a normal manner? The guide doesn't help. Paimon is not a useful figure and a useful entity. In fact, Paimon ruins certain scenes, such as the Yunjin and Shenhe scene. And the community makes jokes, but a lot of those jokes are rooted in truth. The community may not or just simply does not like Paimon sometimes. And I think that the removal of that guide, the removal of this character, wouldn't necessarily harm the game, but it would instead allow the character you're supposed to play as and empath with and connect with flourish. Genshin has great foundations. It has good lore, it has good combat, it has good characters, but characterization and story are a whole separate matter from the gameplay itself. So, if you want to hear more about Genshin's story or story in video games, consider subscribing to this channel. Consider leaving a like down below. It really does help out the channel, and I will be transitioning more into talking about this because I do love talking about story and games. I hope you have watched the Blue Archive video. If you haven't already, I recommend it. But that's my discussion and analysis on Genshin's story. I hope to see you next time, and goodbye.